Hello and welcome back to those of you who have attended of our previous webinars within this series of leading. I'm sitting here. I need to think about what I'm saying. Leading in extraordinary times. And we've had actually three sessions to date. One was to give an overall view of everything that's going to be offered in this 8 series webinars. And then we had really two engaging conversations around different topics that have gone really well. We are actually videotaping these so that we can put them on YouTube. So if you miss anything, we will be sending out the YouTube link so that you can go back and also share it with others. Today, we're actually moving into the topic of change and innovation, and that's going to be given by Dr. John Lewis. I'd like to introduce him now, and he is a consultant, keynote speaker, and coach in knowledge management, learning, and leadership. John is the founder and president of Explanation Age LLC, a management consulting company focusing on thought leadership, organizational change, and knowledge management. John is a scholar practitioner who has pioneered new business and learning models. He has authored the books Explanation Age and Story Thinking, which provide tools for the coming age of knowledge and decision transparency with implications for business, education, and government. I think once again we're going to have a very enlightening conversation and discussion. Please feel free as we go along. We have an interactive discussion, so when you actually use the chat to put something in the chat, we'll try to catch that in questions. You can actually put your hand up and we will call on you so that you can ask your question. Or if we aren't seeing you and you want to get something in, you know what, feel free to kind of jump in and join the conversation and ask the question. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to John, and I hope that you will enjoy this. And again, once we put it on YouTube, that you share it and that we can get this out to the masses. Thanks, and John, it's yours.
Thank you for that introduction, Annie. So I'm John Lewis. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, change and innovation leadership. We're going to run through half dozen or so topics. Quick overview. What is story structure and how does it relate to change? Creative tension within that structure, methodology, leadership, and a short conclusion. Let's start with a couple of quotes. Einstein said, innovation is not the product of logical thought, although the result is tied to logical structure. So we're going to look at story as the structure, the logical structure we're going to move through. MIT said innovation equals invention times commercialization. So we're going to look at the two halves of the story structure. Steve Jobs said innovation is the ability to see change as an opportunity, not a threat. So we'll take a look at the 20 disruption archetypes. Carl Jung says that the greater the contrast, the greater the potential. Great energy only comes from a great tension of opposites. So we'll take a look at creative tension. And finally, we can't have a list of quotations without Mark Twain. He said they did not know it was impossible, so they did it. And we'll take a look at the workability beliefs built into story structure, including the could work beliefs. The new leader's work is really to build a learning organization, says Peter Senge. And we hear in organizations that they will develop their people from novice to expert, as if expert is as high as you can go. But beyond expert, beyond knowing the current system, is something called pioneer and thought leader, where you're actually starting to question the very models of the underlying system that you're using and as an expert have been using to then become a thought leader. And to do that, this learning S-curve shows that at some point, we have to not rely on our expertise of knowing the answers. We have to get better at asking better underlying questions. lose some of our productivity to become more highly inventive and coming up with that new model to then emerge as a thought leader. And the pioneer time is difficult for individuals as they switch gears and start not knowing the answer. It's difficult for HR departments. They're not sure how to measure you when you're getting some things wrong that aren't quite working yet. Sometimes you have to leave the organization and work out of your garage to do that. Or sometimes organizations that are becoming thought leaders know they need to schedule pioneer time every other Friday, sabbatical time, and so forth to allow for that period of time. So with that, let's take a look at story as a structure of change that we'll be moving through to do that. The power of story is physiological, not just psychological. We think in story, it's hardwired in our brain. And I like this one. Storytelling is far too powerful a tool to be relegated to the realms of bedtime fables or barroom banter. It is how humans, in fact, make sense of the world. Once we accept that, we can start to use it to its full constructive potential. And that's what we're going to start doing today. It starts by understanding what Carl Jung has been telling us all along. You are in a story, whether you know it or not. And we may be used to using the word story and storytelling as if they're the same thing. And we're going to have to unlearn that connection. The word story doesn't necessarily automatically mean storytelling. Storytelling uses story as a communication strategy. What we want to do is start using story as an operational strategy. So this is not about learning how to tell a better story. It's learning how to live a better story by understanding the underlying models that operate our organization and compare them to the sense-making process of the story pattern itself. So that was the research that I embarked on. And when I came back with the answers on how they compare, this is one of the reviews that I got. They said, Lewis poses the tantalizing proposition that poor results in education, innovation, and policymaking are rooted in a breakdown between the rational mind and the fundamental models that govern institutions. So I thought, wow, someone gets it. They said it better than I did. So I'll just continue to use their quote. And we'll get a chance to see some of that comparison and breakdown as we move through this. But first off, what do we mean by story? What is a story pattern? One that you probably are familiar with is the hero's journey, popularized by Joseph Campbell. And you notice that as I draw the steps that he gave us, starting at the bottom, status quo, what is that? It's just my routine. It's just what I do every day without thinking. And then something happens, some call to adventure, or as marketing would say, today only half price. So the marketing groups have figured out how to operational story structure very well compared to the other institutions that I looked at. And then we move through the rest of that story, eventually reaching trials, approaching an ordeal, the big thing that we're coming up against. But the story's not over. That would just be a project. We completed something. If we're moving through a story, it's going to change us as well. And we're going to come back through a road back, a new life, and then return transformed. And since it's a sequel, we will go through this cycle again. Let's take a look at how this works in a work environment. You've probably heard something like this. We had successful operations at work, but we knew more competition was coming. We discovered a new idea that we could incorporate and created a new vision. Development took some time, but it all came together. And now operations are even better. When we talk about work, we're usually talking about it in story structure. The problem is when we're actually doing it, we're using some other model to do the work that was invented 50 years ago, using some prescriptive steps. Do these things in this order. We're not sure why. It's helpful to understand the mindsets that are happening, the psychology beneath the story structure. And this is looking at the workability beliefs to start with. You may have heard it either works or it doesn't work. But there's a third workability belief called could work. That's where most projects and innovations start. And then there's the modes that we're operating in. And you may have noticed across languages that they end the sentences end with a question, a period, or an exclamation point. In Spanish, it's so important to know the mode you're in. They'll tell you at the front of the sentence with the upside down question mark. And you see that when the two ideas are combined, that what do we mean by automation? It means I believe what I'm doing works, even if someone else disagrees, that I'm working in a does work state in a reactive mindset. So the word automation doesn't mean necessarily mechanical automation. The root term means mindless work. And I'm sure all of us have done at least 10 things today without having to think about it. It's where we've codified that knowledge. And at the top, ideation means basically looking at what could work from a questioning standpoint. And leaders need to know these underlying mindsets to understand what to accomplish within each one of these phases of story structure as the transformational structure of change, but also how to cross the lines. In other words, at some point, you have to move a team from questioning could work to saying it could work, period. And here's the things that we're doing towards that. Now, you might have noticed already that there's two halves to the story. The top half is for creative and strategic work, and the bottom half, I call the half pipe, if you've seen snowboarding, routine and tactical work. So its top half is innovation and creativity, meaningful learning, thinking slow, projects and transformational change and leadership, versus execution and compliance, rote learning, thinking fast, routines and transactional change and leadership. So what is the relationship? These aren't two separate systems. If you've read the book Thinking Fast and Slow, the question is, how do we move between these two systems? And what story thinking shows us for the first time in psychology is they're both subsets of the same structure, which is story thinking. And all of this starts to sound academic until one day I turn the TV on and I'm watching a show called River Monsters. This is a guy that travels all around the world, trying to find a large fish that there was some folklore around. And he says, I talk with the locals about where the monster has been spotted or even caught. Then I come up with a plan, location, time, the bait I'm going to use, a technique, and I'll give it a few days and then try another bait or find other locals to talk to. He's already moving through this structure in an agile way, not only just moving through it linearly, but able to back up and say, well, I'm expecting to find it. If I don't reach affirmation and actually catch it, I'll back up to ideation, maybe try a different bait. If that's not working, I'll go all the way back to investigation and talk to other locals if that's what I need to do. So agile thinking through story structure is really an innate skill. We're born with it. So the question now is, how does story structure compare to the world's top models related to transformational change? And here's a list of 50 of those models. And if you don't mind, in the chat, enter the number of one of these models, or maybe there's a few that you're interested in that you would say is the most used by you. Let's say you're certified in, or you're the most familiar with, or heard of it, you hear of it a lot, to enter that into chat. These are pretty popular. 6 Sigma, 49 is trust but verify, 8 change management. We see design thinking, 12, OODA loop, 32. These are all very popular ones. Most of us here are probably familiar with these. What I'd like to do is show you what I mean by comparing story to these models. Let's start with project management. If you are certified in project management, then you have memorized that the things you should be doing on a project relate to initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing. Why? What's that list? Where did it come from? Why does it seem to make sense? When you map those steps against story structure, you can see that it basically covers the bases, and that's why we tend to be drawn to those steps. What about this idea of waterfall methodology in business? Requirements are determined. We design, develop, test, deploy, and maintain. So maybe you've memorized those steps and you're wondering, how is that different from agile? Now, there's a lot of different ways people approach agile, but at its base, all it really means is not waterfall. You get to go both directions. You have an arrow on both sides. So you get to develop something, test it, go back and develop something else, redesign that, come back and develop and test it. So you're working your way through the story, but you're able to go back and forth. I'm sorry, was there a question already, Art? Are we good?
No, we're good.
Okay.
Andre added one. He was a little late on the thing.
Oh, okay.
What was 33 on your list?
Let me see. I can back up. I believe. There we go. Do we have?
Oh, PDCA, sure.
Yeah,
sure.
Plan, Do, Check, Act. Yeah,
Right,
another
similar to Udi. Okay.
oldie but a goodie. Right. Good. Okay. Thanks for that. Okay, so let's look at some models that relate to or people have tried to use with innovation. You may be familiar. Someone said the Six Sigma. It uses a DMAIC thinking model, DMAIC, which is define, measure, analyze, improve, control. That's what I mean by most of these models are prescriptive. Do these things in this order. We're not sure why. And this came out of a factory, a manufacturing mindset, where you want to end up controlling in routine something coming off the factory line with no deviations. The same thing comes off the factory line every time. And when something goes wrong, if you're certified in Six Sigma, as I am, you'll know that most of the training is in step 3, analyze, with a lot of statistical root cause analysis of what that deviation is from. Doesn't tell you a whole lot about improving, just improve, come up with something and put that in place. The main thing is to control it to almost zero defects. The Six Sigma is a measurement of almost zero. And that's what that's for. It's been tried in some organizations to be used as an innovation model and had to be pulled out. It was hampering that process. They weren't sure why, but we're going to find out here exactly why. Let's compare it to a real innovation model. This is an easy one, 3 steps, sometimes also called frugal innovation. And the steps just say, be bold, seek available, and repurpose. So this is an example. Let's say that you lived somewhere where you wanted to solve a bold problem, that there was not a lot of transportation options. And you looked around and said, okay, seek the available. Let's see, there are some cars, there's people driving, they seem to have a cell phone. I wonder if they wouldn't mind making a little extra money and picking people up and repurpose this. So if you had followed these 3 steps, you could have invented Uber. It's really just a matter of moving through the story structure, asking the right questions. Now, notice that in investigation here, the question we're asking is entirely different than the questions that we're asking with Six Sigma. There, we're looking to reduce the number of variations in our process, which is the exact opposite of what we're trying to do in innovation, where investigation is looking at a lot of different options of what's available. And I think someone also said design thinking also starts with empathizing with someone who's trying to do something in routine and having trouble with that. Then define, ideate, prototype, test, and implement. And we'll take a look at design thinking in a little more detail a little bit later on. And here's what the review is really talking about. The funny thing is, when you compare it against what's used in our institutions, you'll find out why a lot of things just don't make sense. In healthcare, if you're an MD doctor, you've studied a mindset that they've trained you on called SOAP, S-O-A-P. So you look at the subjective and objective of the problem that someone says they're having, and what you notice Then you determine if you need a blood test, an x-ray, or some type of assessment, and then come up with a plan. And that's where it ends. So I have co-presented this model, which I call SOAP Steps, a clinical process model that completes the cycle story, including supporting people in their new routine and to think about that before they leave the hospital. We've presented that at a few places to try to move healthcare away from an incomplete mental model as the underlying model that runs that institution. Policy making. First off, if you've ever said, okay, kids, 10 o'clock is bedtime, you made a policy, a new mandated routine. So this isn't just a governmental thing. But if you've ever heard that the first step in creating a new law is to submit a bill, there's a reason that didn't make sense, because that's step 4, as we can see, an idea, submitted idea for an idea that you think will improve the situation. But before that single idea, there were probably multiple ideas. What were they? That was probably based on some research, root cause analysis of what was that outcome. And that was based on someone complaining or a particular party complaining. Who were they? Maybe it makes sense if we went right back to step 1. So we want to have transparency through entire sense-making story structure with the way our institutions operate, including education, which tends to focus, unless you get a practicum or some project at the end of your course, on behavioral learning objectives. You will do these things, I'll tell you, and we'll see if you can memorize and quickly be able to adopt those into codified memory and a routine. So this is what our institutions look like when you look at their fundamental models as they map, their primary models as they map against story structure. So let's look at creative tension. First, we'll look at it from an organization standpoint. What do we mean by tension? In the 1950s, you might look at an organization chart and see research and development and operations at the top of the organization chart, where right from the top of the house, there's 2 different kinds of learning happening: transformational change and transactional change. One group involved in asking questions, coming up with the next model, building something new, trying stuff that might work, not work. A lot of pioneers in that group. And then operations, people working in the half pipe or bottom half of the story structure. And you could spend 20 years in one box or the other. The difficulty that we're having now is most leaders have to do both. They could leave their 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock meeting talking about operations and how things are going, and the very next meeting they're in, they're talking about a big change project that's going to change all of that. We're balancing that. And in the innovation literature, they call it organizational ambidexterity, how we're moving between transformational change and transactional change as transformational leaders and transactional leaders, how we're looking at knowledge exploration versus knowledge exploitation. And at the individual level, we also have creative tension. You might have a knowledge sharing session where you're putting 2 people together, and one says, I know how things work in the real world. This is what routine looks like. And another person's really focused on new ideas. I come up with new ideas. And you would really actually want to plan to put those 2 people together to maximize a healthy creative tension to come up with ideas. And the same thing moving around. I see things that can go wrong and I build things. I test and remember what works. I know the answer. Yeah, but I dig into data and new trends for new ideas. You want to put these people together to maximize that healthy tension and not avoid tension. And it turns out that people in your organization tend to have a place that they hang out, that they'd rather hang out. So this is a real study. I changed the names of people on a team. And you might notice that Larry Jones doesn't go to lunch with anyone. He was a little different. He liked the spreadsheets, the data, the research, to find the root cause analysis, while the rest of the team was ready to start building and just jump into the project. And later he would come in with another discovery of something that had to be addressed in the project, otherwise it wasn't going to work. And they called that scope creep. And when you went back to the organization and asked how Larry's doing, they said, he doesn't work here anymore. And you ask why. And they said, well, he wasn't a good team fit. He wasn't a good team fit. And this is how we talk in our organizations when we really don't understand that we're working inside of a story. And we need people that can focus on all of the phases of that story as we put it together. Here's a real example working across companies and cultures where that needs to happen. Xerox PARC invented the first PC with a mouse and graphical user interface. Apple then launched the Lisa and the Macintosh with this idea. And then finally, it became a routine in industry when Microsoft made it the industry norm. What we're really looking at here is what MIT, you might recall, was talking about innovation equaling invention times commercialization. So this was bringing in what Xerox did plus what Apple was able to do. And we're also looking at what the differences between basic research, applied research, and operational thinking. And in addition to that, in this case, it just so happened to be 3 buttons on the first mouse. Apple says we only do 1 button, and Microsoft came out with 2 buttons. And there was a book written about all of this called Fumbling the Future, as if Xerox did something wrong, when I think that story would be written differently today. These were PhDs researching the basic idea that it's a lot harder to recall what commands to type into the command line interface than to recognize and select something that's put in front of you. And they even showed it to Steve Jobs to continue that cycle so that the story could be completed. So what we're trying to accomplish is the model, measure, and management of ideas, looking at the knowledge flow and looking at the idea of tension across the phases of story, and also moving between each phase when some people want to stay a little longer because there's some more work that needs to be done there, and working through that. Then sort of mapping the measurements. What are the overall measurements in the organization of where you think things are? Because if there's an area that's completely missing, then that's the place that's going to keep this cycle from continuing to move through each cycle. And then come up with some strategies for people, process, and technologies. So you may have, let's see, an affirmation, you may have an answer capability. That answer could be an FAQ sheet. It could now be a chatbot. But maybe you don't have any discovery capability. You don't have any software or people that are looking at mass amount of data and discovering different types of associations to help you continue moving through this cycle. Ultimately, that should lead us to an innovation maturity model. Let's think in terms of the first level, which would be sustaining operations. In other words, you have an operational group. You're not thinking about improving anything. Or maybe there's some creativity at step 2, but it's isolated events. Or you move to trial and error, experimentation, and then ultimately what you should be shooting for is integrated R&D with operations, ongoing innovations, and organizational ambidexterity. Let's take a look at a real example of what that would look like. At Apple, Steve Jobs had multi-generational vision. When he put out the iPod, he already knew he was going to add apps and then add a capability for it to be an iPhone, and then introduce the iPad. So each generation would fund the R&D for the next generation. So as you're making money in operations from one product, you're funding the R&D to go through and create the next one. So all of this strategy was already in place, and that's what we mean by an integrated strategy for innovation. All right, let's take a look at methodology. How would you lead people through a process for innovation? Well, I think the base model for this whole process started with Thomas Kuhn's observation in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. In his case, he was looking at the model change between planetary motion ideas, that between Newton and Einstein. So Newton had his models of what what he thought would allow us to predict where the planets would be. But the planet Mercury, with gravitational forces so close to the sun, was not being observed to be where it was predicted to be. So people were willing to listen to new ideas. His steps were normal science, model drift, model crisis, and at that point, the scientific community recognized we have a crisis with our model. We need to address that, maybe come up with another model. So they're willing to entertain new ideas, which is why we call it model revolution, beginning that process, and then finally a paradigm change, a model change, which Einstein introduced, and famously introduced by saying, "Forgive me, Newton." And I think that this is an important step here, because this is what we miss in our organizations today. We think that if we call out something about the design or model that we're operating in that was developed by someone in our organization a year or 2 or 5 years ago, that somehow that's disparaging them or disparaging the model. But we need to keep this cycle constantly moving. It's just acknowledging that we're standing on the shoulder of giants. That's the process. And if we don't understand that and make that part of the culture, it's the primary reason we don't have a continued innovation. So it's from this standpoint that I was curious with earlier this year when MIT published a review of design thinking. They said design thinking was supposed to fix the world. Where did it go wrong? And concluded that design processes themselves need to evolve beyond design thinking. So there's a couple of quick quotes from this article, and I have the link at the top if you want to read the whole thing. In recent years, for a number of reasons, the shine of design thinking has been wearing off. Critics have argued that its short-term focus on novel, naive ideas has resulted in unrealistic and ungrounded recommendations. At Google, they saw that for all the excitement and post-its that they generated from the brainstorming sessions, it didn't usually lead to built products or really solutions of any kind. And then it says the first step of the design thinking process, which we saw earlier, is for the designer to empathize with the end user through close observation of the problem. And this puts the designer's honed sense of empathy at the center of both the problem and the solution, with empathy over expertise. So this is, mental models is my dissertation area. And after reading this, I also just added a couple notes for myself. My review, given, what I'd gone through with Newton for Forgive Me as an idea, I think that really that since earlier models were created, we've learned more about dopamine, emotions, positive inquiry, and being wired for story. And with empathy as step one, the focus is on the problem and not the opportunity. And that sets the mindset in a completely different direction. Also, step-based methodologies work for predetermined outcomes, but innovation requires activating the creative mind in nonlinear ways. It requires a map in addition to directions, and that map is story structure. Let's take a look at how using story structure would be a different approach for innovation, where you want to start with where people are when they come in. They might have a dream or a goal or a process in mind. If they say, I've got a dream, I just thought of something, you can't say, hold on, that's step 3. We haven't reached that yet. You want to be able to capture that. If they are thinking from the end of the story of what the goal is that they're shooting for, you want to be able to capture that. Or if they're ready to start from the beginning of the process, you want to be able to start with wherever they are. We'll take a look at a little bit of each of those 3. So if you want to start an ideation, you want to be able to say, okay, let's capture that idea, but then we'll backfill other questions. How's this project feasible? How do you see it working in routine? What is the problem or opportunity that you think is currently there that it solves? Or if you want to start an affirmation at the end of the story, here's the goal, and let's move through story structure and come back and see how we did. This is using quad loop learning, which was evolved out of story thinking, as you can see, to give us exact feedback. It's beyond double loop learning. The same idea as double loop learning, but more exact. Where compliant feedback means it says it may be time to stop for the day, Our productive feedback says it may be time to sharpen the axe. And inventive feedback says it may be time to invent a chainsaw. And perceptive feedback says it may be time to research another form of energy beyond wood. So we have to think about each of the phases differently as we come through a different perception. So you may have training and controls in place to maintain the current systems, or optimizing your current system for productive feedback. You may want to reduce some waste or variations in that system, and that's what Lean and Six Sigma do. You may be certified and have operations around that. But a lot of organizations sort of stop there, because if you start to move into design thinking, you're starting to take bigger risks, and it takes bigger budgets. But there's no reason for the conversations that you're having now not to extend into thinking of at least incremental, if not radical, innovative strategies. And then in researching possibilities, looking at how to explore and inspect, look outside the organization and as well as within. So the methodology based on story structure is called ILETM, which is using the first letters of the steps: identify opportunities, look into gap analyses, envision solution, develop solution, evaluate trueness, and maintain status quo. But it's a cycle. Do that while also keeping an eye out for new opportunities. And each of these steps has a particular shape that helps us think about what we're accomplishing there. A very visual approach. Shapes represent key ideas used by story thinkers when leading change. So let's start with identifying opportunities. We'll take a look at some questions that you might need to ask. Is it still acceptable? Can we ignore it? Can we just try again? What risk does it create? All the way down to what opportunity does this situation create? Maybe it's a design issue. So this is a short list of the questions you would be asking in a disruption. And you're probably going to be dealing with more than one at a time. So you need a priority matrix process. You're probably familiar with important versus urgent. But the best practice is really to use multiple lenses into prioritization. Look at the long-term impact versus the effort, if you can just knock something out, or your ability versus your passion for something, when to outsource or delegate, and that sort of thing. And this is just 3 of about a dozen that I use in a workshop. And then finally, looking at the idea of moving a problem as a problem to an opportunity. Just in your mind, thinking of something as a problem and saying, how can I shift this to an opportunity? So as you see here, focusing just on the problem can increase fixation. We call it fixation, and reduce innovation. Like, there's many examples with innovation. One is penicillin as a famous example, an experiment that went wrong. They left it out too long, and they could have said, oh, I forgot this didn't go as I thought. We made a mistake. Just throw that away and let's start again. But when looking at what had happened and started growing, they started thinking, well, maybe there's something we can do with this. People tend to think, well, I'll be creative and start innovating when I get up into ideation. I'm not going to worry about that when I'm reacting in disruption. But it really does start here. It starts how you're reacting to something out of the norm. Otherwise, you'll ask the wrong questions during investigation, and it'll take you into a different place. So you see some examples here all the way down to the bottom where being a pessimist actually makes you part of the problem eventually, versus an optimist, you become part of the opportunity. So we spent a lot more time on this in a workshop. I'm trying to get through and introduce you to a lot of concepts here in just an hour. Let's go ahead and take a look at investigation. And the triangle represents the gap and analyses down to root causes and factors. So beyond symptoms, what's really going on? That's what we want to know. And as the picture shows, we'll start with a gap. What is the gap? What's the current state? And what's the desired state? A lot of times we think of this as, okay, current state is it's negative. It's a problem. And the desired state is the benchmark, what it's supposed to be doing or what other people are doing. But it could be that your current state is a positive sentiment. We're doing great. This is what's working. Here's all the cool things that we've got and the people we've got. And we want an aspirational gap. What's the desired state? We want to go even further. So we shouldn't be thinking of just problems. We should be thinking about how to approach it also as a positive. And once we've identified that gap, look at the analyses, not just with 5 whys, but also 5 whats. So you've probably heard of 5 whys. Ask why 5 times. Why that, then why that, and then you find a root cause. But we live in complex times, and sometimes what you're really going to find are root factors. And they found this like in aviation accidents, where you'd say, well, it's hard to nail down the exact cause. What are some of the factors? Well, it was a qualified pilot, but still kind of new. It was snowing, and in this case, I'm thinking of the ratio of the fluid that they're putting on the wings for de-icing was a little off. They had to wait a little longer than normal before taking off, and these factors combined what really came together, pointing to what caused the accident. Let's take a look at a real example of this idea of starting from a positive standpoint. This is a true story from NASA, where the right front wheel stopped working on the Mars rover Spirit, and NASA tried and tried and tried and could not solve it. They could not get it to work. So finally, someone asked, what's still working? Appreciative inquiry. Well, they started looking through that list and said, well, we could actually drive it backwards. We could drive the rover backwards. So with the stuck wheel dragging behind, it pushed away the top layer of soil to reveal a new discovery, salt, which meant there was once water on Mars. The key point here is the way that we think about our current state can affect our future state. And that takes us into ideation. Let's just jump to the bottom. It says ideation needs lots of ideas. It's not the place to create the one best idea. Instead, start with question storming. What's question storming? Before brainstorming, let's just make sure we're even asking the right questions before we try to answer them. And then crazy idea storming. You're only allowed at some point to come up with crazy ideas. And maybe crazy idea 1 has an aspect that combines with crazy idea 2 aspect that starts to come together as a bold innovation. And then possible idea storming, finally an idea selection that will move you into expectation. So this is a diamond that represents that, the divergence, then convergence of ideas. And I've seen a lot of organizations that really want that shape to be an arrow. Like, we've got an idea, let's move forward. And don't want to spend the time really expanding it out before then bringing it back into convergence. And that requires, starting with the questions. What are we solving? What are the right questions? Even, are we talking to the right people? So I wanted to stop with that idea. And if you wouldn't mind typing into chat, there's a question here for us. It said, if you are starting a new airline company, who would you talk to? And enter that into chat. Customers, passengers, those are fantastic answers. You get the idea. People on the ground, pilots, baggage handlers, right? All of them. FAA. These are super answers. I wanted to share with you an idea about what I meant with the quad loop learning and working inside and outside of the norm. These are all inside answers. When Southwest was starting an airline, they talked to NASCAR. Why would they talk to NASCAR? One of the things they realized is that planes don't make money when they're on the ground. And to be competitive against the other airlines, they wanted to learn from the pit crews in NASCAR how to quickly turn a plane around, how to combine the ideas of what they learned in the pit crew of a car to quickly turn a plane around. And that would be the definitive new idea that would allow them to compete. Just to give you an idea of how this is coming together and what quad loop learning is about, why these questions are important as you move through innovation. Thanks for entering that. Let's summarize. We're not going to have time today to move through all of these, But basically, you can start with a dream, start with a goal, start with a process, let people start and come in with an idea in your organization, capture it and move from there instead of telling them to wait for a step in a process. All right, how do you lead people through these methodologies? What does leadership need to look like for innovation and change? First off, the whole concept of leadership is changing. As you can see in the graph, over time, over the years, the idea of using the term authority has gone down versus the word knowledge. A future world where knowledge shared becomes power clearly breaks away from the bureaucratic model. So that takes us to this diagram, which is looking at the balance that leaders need to have between ability and desire to influence versus also understand. And that as these are two separate things, a lot of times we'll run into what we call the sophomore leader who wants to influence and has a desire to influence more than a capability to understand. And as the tree represents without deep roots, that brings on some problems. And that could be someone, a leader in your group that would be fine in the transactional area. You could memorize steps and know how to move quickly, how fast things need to happen. But moving them over into an R&D type of environment as a leader, if that's where you're balancing most of that ambidexterity for that position, could be where your innovation is lacking. Well, the Leadership Quarterly did a 25-year review of this idea of leadership development and concluded present practices are primitive. What do we mean by leader and leadership, and how do you develop them? So new profiles are based on change and the story framework. Of course, leaders need to have vision and courage and patience, enthusiasm, boldness, accountability, composure, and the list goes on like a laundry list. But there's actually specific places that you're leading in that you need to bring those out. And some people are better at some than others. And this is a new type that I use of leadership development assessment to help with the new type of tools needed. And in comparing change management, just what we typically mean by change management versus change leadership, the management tends to focus on the rollout. Here's the change coming, and someone is already in automation doing their job. You train them to do it, and then you come in and go, okay, here's the new thing rolling out, and see who's resisting, any change resistors, and you're focused on that rollout versus looking at change leadership, saying start with an engagement mentality, engage with where they are. They're in automation, they're doing a routine, doing their job. Just talk to them right there, engage them right there in a conversation and say, yeah, this is what you're trained to do. Let's take you in disruption. What are some things that don't work about it? Can you imagine some things a year from now that would put us at a place with competition that we might want to get ahead of? Work with people through the entire cycle, and then you don't have that problem. And in those conversations that you're having with people, what do you hear? What do you hear in those conversations? Because it's important to bring people into conversations, make sure that people are being respectful, that everyone gets a chance. But what I've seen is that most people bring their mental model into those conversations, which usually is problem solution. So when you map the amount of time spent in the story structure, that's what the graph on the left would look like. It's spent blustering, yeah, this is wrong and that's wrong, and I have an idea, we should do this and this, and going into ideation, not the backstory, how you even got to this point, analysis, action steps, or specific goals. And then also, what reasons do you hear? Here's why we should do these things. So most conversations and documents provide reasons and explanation patterns, mainly from the story half pipe. Leading change and innovation requires first principles thinking, not half pipe thinking, and tools can help. So the largest inference pattern, which holds all others, is story structure, narration. There's more than just induction, deduction, and later abduction was added. And I think that large language models will soon be able to help us provide for us a real-time feedback on our explanations to produce a graph like this to realize that we are basically, what you'll find when you map this manually is that citation is used the most. Why? Because I'm citing someone else. The pressure's off of me because I'm going to say the reason is that's the way we do it. That's what the boss said. That's what the manual says. That's what the law is. That's why we should do it this way. And that's totally probably against moving into innovation. So as you start to look at the conversations and the reasons through those conversations, you'll find places of why you're getting stuck moving towards innovation. So bottom line is, as a leader, you're developing the organization, team, and individuals. And from an organization standpoint, you might want to think about using a matrix type structure when those conversations are around the top half, innovation, versus the hierarchy all the time. It works fine in the lower half. It's for transactional, and it works great for control as well as a fast escalation. Or with teams, be aware of the 5 team dysfunctions and where they generally fall within a story and work through those with your team. And from an individual standpoint, Forbes put out a report of the 6 personality traits of successful entrepreneurs and where those traits fall and work on those at the individual level. Okay, so quick conclusion. Bottom line, as I say, without a map, we are lost in geography and epistemology. And that map is story structure from beginning to end and with cycle and go again. And given that, we can go into an organization, look at how we're managing ideas, how ideas flow, where the tension points are, and actually get the most out of the creative tension, and make sure that we're developing the novice, the expert, the pioneer, and the thought leader. Okay, visualization is powerful, and maps change the tone of the conversation. Instead of saying, you're behind or you're too slow, we end up saying you're here and I'm here, and it changes the whole team conversation. And why are we developing thought leaders? For the sake of what? Well, economics is not about supply and demand. Economic growth springs chiefly from incentive, not from incentive. Sorry. Wealth actually springs from the expansion of information and learning, profits and creativity that enhance the human qualities as its beneficiaries, as it enriches them. So this is what change and innovation leadership should accomplish. And with that, thanks so much for attending today. Please feel free to contact me for any questions or follow-up. Okay, back to you, Art or Annie.
Okay, well, once again, we have had a very good discussion. And again, these will be going out on YouTube. We're at the top of the hour, and I just want to open it to see if anybody has 1 or 2 questions, if you have time to talk with John. Everyone's, yeah, thank you. Very good presentation.
Okay.
Okay. Well, once again, we are running a series of these, and we have 4 more to come. We will be sending out correspondence, usually through LinkedIn and some of the groups. Feel free to share it, and also feel free to give us feedback. And we will definitely be sending out the YouTube soon, and we hope that once again you'll give us feedback on that as well. Thank you for coming, and for those who continue to support us, we really appreciate and invite you back constantly. Okay? Thank you. Art, do you have anything to say?
It's a lot of food for thought because this is a KM group, right? Our audience are knowledge managers, knowledge practitioners. So I think a lot of material here for us to take back and think about where can we insert knowledge management. I think there are plenty of opportunities here. So that's something I'd say is very good for all of us to think about as knowledge managers, because how can we enable the flow of knowledge across those different phases of that change cycle. We can do anything we can do to help enhance that flow of an exchange of knowledge would greatly enhance what John has put together. So just something for us to think about as KMers.
Okay. Thanks for coming, and see you next week, Wednesday, 12 noon, lunchtime again. Okay. Have a great week.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.